we are going to jump into training and development here. Chapter 8. We all set up here? Okay. We're good. So I want to contrast the two really quick before we get going. A lot of people use training and development kind of interchangeably. They're actually very different. So a lot of times what I'll do, you can see it down here, I'll pass like a pen and a paper on the classroom, like just kind of say something or recall an experience that changed who you are. Not taught you how to weld or taught you how to shoot a basketball, but kind of changed what you're about. And we go around the room. For some people want to share, some people don't. But inevitably, it is a negative experience. It's very rare when someone says, hey, it was the fourth quarter, there was 10 seconds left, and I was the quarterback and threw an 80-yard touchdown, and at that moment, I knew I could do anything. No, it doesn't happen like that. It's usually like parents divorce or grandma died or something it kind of shook you to your core. And then I say, well, and how did that affect you? And they almost always have, not always, but almost always have some kind of a positive testimony. Here's how that changed me for the better, or developed my character, developed my perspective, or made me work hard, or something like that. Which in some ways is ironic. If you think about human nature, we actually try to avoid pain and pursue pleasure, right? It's called hedonism. And yet when we're asked to recall the things that shaped our lives for the better, there's usually an element of pain involved. But having said that, so training development, very different things. We're going to focus this chapter in on training specifically with a key definition. It goes like this: is a process whereby people acquire capabilities to perform jobs. So there's a few assumptions in this. To start with, we're assuming that people can actually acquire capabilities. That is, people can learn to do things. And then they will actually do them different on the job. Second, there's an assumption that capabilities affect performance on the job, which I think we have that. But you can see as we look at this, we go, okay, each one of these has to actually tie together, or it's not training. If I'm not adding capabilities, it's not training. If I'm not adding capabilities for performance on the job, then it's not organizational training. It might be helpful, it might even be educational, but when we talk about training, it's very specific. We're basically tooling somebody up to do better on their job. From a macro level perspective, there's a few things I want to say on this. Strategic training, that just means like you're actually being intentional. You're thinking about what does our organization need, our workforce need, that's consistent with our mission and our strategy. It's not just training for training's sake, right? We have a particular pathway that we're walking through with objectives and tactics as a company, and we want to tool up and equip our human capital to be able to go in that direction. The other thing that it can do is if you have a bit of a strategic training plan, you're not going to assume that everything can be solved by training. There are things called states and traits. You can teach me to weld, but you may not be able to teach me astrophysics. So certain things I can and can't learn. Certain things can and can't be trained. And so to say, oh, well, we have a problem, the solution must be more training. Well, no, you pause for a minute and see if there's evidence that training will actually help. So you don't need to focus in on the content of this slide, but get the process of the slide. The idea is that if you're a manager and you're leading a team, you should be able to articulate to that team, this is the training and this is how it fits in with organizational strategy or some kind of organizational imperative. Meaning if it's sexual harassment training, that's based on the values of our company. If it's training about intercultural competence, that's because the strategy of our company is to be a multinational company in 5 years, and we have to have some kind of a global mindset somewhere in our human capital to be able to facilitate that. So you can see strategies, you can see tactics, or the outcomes of those strategies, and then our training activities. So as a manager, you got to be able to convince or sell, whatever the word is, but in a matter of like procedural justice, to explain to your team, no, what we're doing is actually important. And then if you can't, of course, ask the question. And sometimes you don't have that control, but you can ask the question, why are we doing this? And that's just fine. A couple legal issues in training. This is from a kind of an employee advocate, kind of tactician level for human resource management. And there's a bunch of them, but I want to point to one specifically. The very first one, selecting individuals for training. It's a constant battle where a firm will say, man, we're having challenges getting the composition of our management or our executive team to look like our workforce. We now have our workforce kind of in terms of demographic composition. It looks like the labor market. So say, yeah, we're doing good there. There's, back to chapter 3, there's 15% Hispanic employees in the labor market, and there's 15% in our company. But when we look at management and executive level leadership, we see there's 2%, and for some reason we're not able to change that. We're just going to put someone in the role who's not ready, etc. A lot of that goes back to the 5 years earlier when you had a management development program and nobody was thinking, who gets into this? You may have thrown it out there and said, oh, whoever wants in, whoever wants to do this, you can do it. And what happened is you had a particular demographic group say, yes, I want in, but not other demographic groups. Or you hand selected people and it wasn't some kind of utilization analysis wasn't considered, meaning the people that were hand selecting, do they look like everybody else on our executive team or not? So that kind of lays the foundation for then who's ready. After 3 or 4 years of some kind of a management development program, who's actually ready for the executive level. So just a heads up, when we are establishing training, we got to be intentional about who actually is going to get this training, because in theory, if we're going to design it to make them better at their job, what we're doing is we're handing somebody, in a sense, kind of a leg up on their job. Types of training, this is just a framework to know. It's nothing super complex about it. There's legally required training on every job. If you've ever been involved like DOT or truck driving, or, well, actually any job, safety, sexual harassment, diversity, stuff like that, you're going to say, we're going to do this each time, maybe once a year, once every 2 years. And some of that is about values of the company, and some of that is about what's called an affirmative defense, meaning if I train you how to safely operate a bandsaw, and you use that bandsaw and you cut your buddy with that saw, I can say, from a liability perspective, I can say, no, wait a second. Like, there was a solid training that was vetted, that everyone agreed that this is a good training, and they took it and they knew better. They knew they shouldn't have taken the bandsaw and thrown it at their buddy, something like that. So it has to do with liability, but not all. There's so legally required training. There's basic remedial skills that happens depending on your type of job. Job and technical training. This is especially when you're using equipment, or especially when like a software, or if you have an IT-based job, which of course many are, that has changed. So you don't just change the person's main tool and say, go figure it out. You give them training. And then of course soft skills. We see that more when we get into like team leads and managers. As an agent of the company and as modeling appropriate behaviors, but it, of course, can happen at any level of the organization. Okay, 2 main things I want to hit here. One of them is an onboarding process, so we have that in our vernacular, and the other one is what's called an ADDIE model, which I'll explain in just a minute. It's kind of just a trained design model. So first, onboarding. So orientation is a major step in onboarding. It's basically when you hire somebody, when you get them to say yes, keep in mind you've spent time and money and effort and meetings and interviews, etc., saying, yes, this is the person that we want. Now you've hired them. What are you going to do with that asset? Are you going to say, here's your workstation, go? Or are there things you can do on the front end as they are being onboarded into your organization to make it to where you're a higher possibility of good performance, but really about retention? Meaning, after 3 days on the job, do they say, this place is awesome, like they were ready for me here? Maybe a weird example is if you go over to a friend's house to have dinner at 6, and at 6:30 they start asking, hey, so what do you want to do for dinner tonight? You go, well, you actually weren't ready for me. Like I'm not really kind of welcomed in here. So this is almost like a hospitality component. Because obviously you can see some of the benefits, good impression, but a big part of it is socialization to the culture, the environment, the job, the expectations, and they come up to speed more quickly. You can see a few things. One of them on the onboarding process is you want to know, what do new hires expect? So how do we find that information? You go take your last 10 new hires and you got a focus group, or you take them out to lunch and you say, hey guys, you've been here for a month, 6 months, a year. What would have been really helpful in the first few days on your job? What would have been like just money in your hand helpful for how to get integrated quickly. And they may come up with some crazy ideas. I mean, you don't know. Like, hey, parking sucked. And is there any way thing we can do about that, just in the first week, just until we get settled? Or I didn't meet my manager for the first 7 days. A lot of organizations now, I know Google and IBM are both big on this. You're going to meet your manager the first day there. No matter where your manager is, they will actually schedule your start date around you're going to connect with that person. So little things like that. Okay, create connections, add networks. That's your friendship. The Gallup organization's actually got some neat research that says if you have a best friend at work, that's one of the best predictors of turnover. So it's getting people connected quickly. Anyway, you get the idea. Basically, be intentional. When you bring someone on board, you go, what do we do to make sure that they come up to speed quickly, and then it's a positive experience. How do we know if that's working well, right? So we've put all this time and effort into creating a good onboarding process. How do we know? And onboarding, of course, is a component of training. A few things: tenure turnover rate, new hire failure rate. So when someone quits after 90 days, we go, what happened? First year turnover rate is a killer. We talked about this a little bit in the turnover section and in job attitudes. But when you've gone through all this effort to get somebody kind of right skill set, right time, right number of people, and they quit in the first year before they're kind of higher up on the productivity level, it's so frustrating, so expensive. So part of that is adapting your onboarding program to do it. So that's it on onboarding. Give them big hugs. Well, maybe not, really, but give them big hugs when they come in and get them set up for success early. Okay, ADDIE model. The ADDIE model is like the bread and butter basic model. Anybody who's in training knows this. We have an entire elective course set up on how to do each one of these really well, including in our graduate program. So it begins with assessment. That is, if we're going to train on anything, the first question is assessment. What do we actually need training on? Is there a need for training, etc.? And what is the gap between where we are and where we need to be? Then you design, based on that assessment, you design your training program. Here's what it looks like. You develop it, ready to launch it, and then you launch it. That's the implementation. And then evaluation is, how do we do? That's one of the steps that almost everybody leaves out, but how did we do? Did it accomplish the intended effect? So a big component of the ADDIE model, of course, is the training needs assessment. Is training going to work? What form should it take on? Who's going to do it? Who's going to get trained? Who's in? Who's out? What's the process? What's the content? What are the dates? What's the budget? All that kind of stuff. And of course, the last one, how do we know if it actually worked? What is the performance assessment we're looking at the end? We'll get to this later, but a lot of times with the evaluation, what we do is we pass a stupid piece of paper around the room and we say, on a scale of 1 to 10, did you have a good time? We didn't do the training because so they would have a good time. We did it so people would learn and behave different and affect their job. Remember the definition, adding capabilities to their job so that they could perform differently and better. The other one is we say, would you recommend this training program to a friend? It's like, oh my goodness. So the evaluation has to be tied in with the purpose, of course, of the training. So how do we know if there is a training that's even needed? So here's a few things we can take from. If we have the same grievance, if we have 20 managers in our group and we have, I'm just throwing out numbers, 50 grievances a year, and those 50 grievances are between 2 managers, okay, let's go figure out there's some kind of training or leader development or something that needs to happen there. So the grievances or accidents are a big one, of course. We have witnessed in the safeties chapter, but when there's an accident, you're going to document what the steps you're going to take to prevent accidents in the future. Almost always one of those components is training. So you can see there's a million things here, performance evaluations. The idea is there something non-normal popping in the data that go, okay, that's standing out. Either there's an outlier or something unique that it wasn't that way last year or the year before or the year before, then you want to deal with it. Or it's always been that way, but our competitors don't seem to have these same problems. So how can we redesign work? How can we do training to solve it? this tells us if there's actually a problem. Just because an employee, a couple of employees, or a manager, executive says, "Hey, we need training on this." This is where you stand back and go, "No, wait a second. Let's get some data, and let's find out if it's an attribution issue or if there really is something that we need to train on and deal with."